welcome everyone to GlasgowTea. It's so nice to have you all here. And this is our second session. Rebecca would normally be joining me, but she can't join today, so I'm just going solo. So hopefully we can still get by without her. She is an integral part of the team, but I'll do my best to hold the show. Today we're going to be joined by Michelle. It's so exciting to have you here, Michelle. I can't wait to hear what you're going to talk about. It's so such a kind of interesting topic for me, because obviously my research is looking at mental health, and I think you're going to talk a bit about mental illness data and how we can kind of handle that in an open access way. So just before we kind of hear a bit more about you, I just wanted to touch on kind of what GlasgowTea is in case anybody hasn't been before. So GlasgowTea is part of the Reproducibility Network, which is an international journal club. And basically we're just like a group of early career researchers that hopefully we wanted to create kind of a safe space where we can all learn about open science together and it not be too intimidating, and that we can just all share kind of our knowledge and learn together. So yeah, we're trying to just have some speakers at the moment. Since everything's online, we're taking full advantage of being able to have people from wherever they're based. So yeah, we're just going to have a talk from Michelle and then hopefully some chat afterwards. This is obviously being recorded because we're going to put it on YouTube. So I'll pin Michelle once she begins, and then I'll cut the video for the questions afterwards. But if you are worried about being seen or anything, like maybe it's totally fine to just put your camera off, just whatever you're comfortable with. And if you just want to save any questions that you have till the end, then you can, unmute yourself and ask them to Michelle yourself. Or if you want to put them in the chat, then that's totally fine as well. We can have a look at that. So Michelle, it would be great if we could just maybe learn a little bit more about you first. Would you like to kind of introduce yourself and your background?
Yeah. So thanks for everyone who's turned up today. This will be quite a weird quantitative talk. I'm going to say that from the start. Like, when I speak about quants, people are like, you're not a quant researcher, you're just a weird qualitative person who's fell into statistics. I'm Michelle Jamieson. I am in the third year of my never-ending PhD. It's like Groundhog Day. And I'm based at the University of Glasgow. So my background is actually in psychology, done it at undergrad, done a couple of masters for sort of self-flagellation, and then got on to a PhD, which isn't actually in psychology and also confuses people. I'm within social sciences, but it's an advanced quantitative methods PhD that's funded through the ESRC. So my PhD was originally, I will contextualise this, was originally looking at what we termed severe mental illness and employment outcomes for people in Scotland, and we were going to look at that across the lifespan, and this was going to be a novel linkage of NHS Scotland data and census data, but then the pandemic happened and I lost access to that data after 3 years of work, and had to completely reorientate to new data. So I'll speak a little bit about the new data at the end of the talk, but this talk today will primarily focus on the years of work I've done trying to triangulate and come up with some sort of system to help other quantitative researchers identify severe mental illness in data that doesn't explicitly ask the question or record diagnostic labels. So that is the talk today. Let's get into it. So hopefully the presentation will work. Usually when I do a presentation, it automatically captions me, but it can't understand my accent, so it just comes out with gibberish. So let's hope that doesn't happen.
That looks great.
Let me see caption. There we go. So, no, don't go without me. Not ready. So, I can never come up with catchy titles for things. So today is what does, and I've put it in quotation marks, what does severe mental illness look like in open health and admin data? I will kind of go into this. Severe mental illness, I mean, if you're in quants, you'll know you have to define things in order to identify them in data. And severe mental illness is a term that's you'll see most often used in research, but I'll speak a little bit about it in my research positionality statement. It's not something I'm personally comfortable with, professionally or personally, and I suppose I'm jumping the gun, but I'll go into that in a minute. So this talk today, hopefully we'll keep it to about 20, 25, 30 minutes. Stop me if I go over, by the way, because I go off into side stories sometimes that isn't actually helpful. So yeah, first I'll go into a little bit about me as a researcher and where I fit into quants as someone who is only come into quants in the PhD. Well, that's not true. You know what I mean? I'll go into it. So, and then we'll go into background into what is severe mental illness and why does it matter in data? Like, why should we find it? And then I'll go into a little bit about how can you find the presence of SMI in data that doesn't explicitly ask or record any sort of thing around severe mental illness, and then a little bit wrapping up basically. So researcher background. My background, I said a little bit in the intro, but I come from a psychology background. I was mostly quants up until my PhD. Did have some stats background because obviously psychology has stats in it. No one told me this when I applied to undergrad, by the way, so I was very shocked. And so why am I placed to do this research? So my PhD research investigates what is termed severe mental illness. You'll also see it termed as complex mental health conditions or difficulties, which I actually prefer. And I'm really open about this on social media or Twitter if anyone follows me, but I have lived experience of a complex mental health condition, namely psychosis. So I always say in these talks, my data, like I'm represented in the data, not me personally, but people with my own lived experience and diagnostic label are represented in the data. And that has thrown up some really interesting personal ethical questions and reflexivity questions, which you wouldn't necessarily have as a quantitative data scientist, whatever you want to researcher, whatever you want to call yourself. And it's actually opened up a whole really interesting side of things in my work, which I'm now very shouty about reflexivity and quantitative data science. And some people find it really weird, but I'm like, no, just do it, people. So that's why I always say that's why I'm best placed to do this research. And that's not to say that if you don't have lived experience of something, you can't research it, because obviously thousands of people research stuff they don't have experience of every day. But I do believe that my own lived experience has brought an interesting new direction to quantitative work. So yeah, that's sort of prefacing the weird reflexivity chat we'll get into. So what is severe mental illness? So obviously the concept of severe mental illness is ambiguous. I'm going to put these down into a little square so I can see the rest of my screen. So the term severe mental illness, obviously I said at the start, it's not something I'm completely comfortable with, but we arrived at this definition in my work because it's the definition and the term most often seen. And personally come from a psychology background, a lived experience background. My understanding of what we term severe mental illness or complex mental health conditions actually comes from trauma, whichever that might be. So personally, I don't feel that the term severe mental illness is helpful, but it is helpful when it comes to quantitative work because it's the term we most often see. So it is actually ambiguous. There's many interpretations and there's so many different definitions. Like when I was getting into obviously arriving at definitions so I could then move on to identifying SMI in the data, I thought the NHS would just have a very nice, clean gold standard definition of SMI, and then that would be it. I'd be able to triangulate my variables and measure it in data, but that didn't happen. So it took quite a while, but I had to basically triangulate my own definition of SMI so I could then go on to try and identify it in data that didn't measure it. It took so long. But yeah, basically that's core SMI. The SMI definition we arrived at refers to individuals that live with psychological conditions that are often debilitating to day-to-day life in either a functional or occupational way. So that could be daily living tasks to employment outcomes. Obviously, employment outcomes is one of the main measures that I'm looking at. So basically, there is no gold standard definition of what qualifies as severe mental illness. I'm hoping something does come out of this work that leads to more of a gold standard definition. So the decision on included conditions actually came from a working literature review, which because of the pandemic has now had to move on to a different working literature review. Obviously, previous research came into it, a lot of trawling the WHO's stuff and the ICD-10 at the time, although it's ICD-11 now. And so basically I came up with a working definition, and within this working definition I included several diagnostic labels. So diagnostic labels are something you would see in ICD-10, the DSM-5, things like that, and it's things like schizophrenia, psychosis, depression. And so I basically got all of these definitions together in a massive table and put them out to practicing psychiatrists to undertake a clinical review, so they could be externally validated as, quotation marks, a severe mental illness. And that's how I arrived at my working definition, which would hopefully help me identify SMI in data sets that didn't actually ask that question or really measure it at all, which you think it would, considering half of the data sets were NHS data sets, but we'll go into that. I think it might be in the next slide. Oh no, it'll be the slide after this. So basically, why does this definition matter? Why do you need a working definition to identify it in the data? So basically, there is no gold standard question or measurement that captures severe mental illness. Like, say, you can get data on the UK data service that's like, say, the Scottish Household Survey. You'll usually see questions like, in general, how has your health been in the past 12 months? And then it's labels like good, bad, fairly good, things like that. You don't actually get any questions, or it's very rare in these types of data sets that you get a question that specifically measures not just mental illness, but complex or severe mental illness. So you won't really see a question asking, have you experienced psychosis in the last 12 months, for example. It's just not there. And when they do ask health questions, you usually see like 12 different levels for physical conditions, and then mental health is just the one level out of like 18 choices. So that's a whole other talk. So yeah, basically it had to make choices to consider this, and that included the type of data set used, which at the time, and we'll go into the next slide, was NHS datasets, and also admin type datasets, including the SLS and the census in Scotland. And we also had to, like, you know it yourselves, if you're doing research, you have to call a stop to things so you can then get on with the next part of your research. So when it came to diagnostic conditions and code to includes, which also in themselves necessitate a definition of each condition, like this code for schizophrenia and ICD-10 will be like F19, and that itself has a definition and several levels to meet for that diagnostic label to be applied. You just have to call in somewhere, and for someone who struggles with perfectionism, this was hard. But we did come to this working conclusion. We did have all the conditions listed. I was ready to go to try and identify this in the data sets. But yeah, your choices basically should be driven by the purpose of the measurement. And unsurprisingly, these will be, I say partly subjective, but not to go into a rant about quantitative and objectivity. But yeah, I will every day, every hour of every day, argue with someone who says that quantitative, any sort of quantitative methodology is objective and gold standard. It's not. It's subjective purely because you're a human being, you have subjective experiences, and you interacting with that data is subjective. So no, it's not objective. I can go into this a little bit more at the end. So data sets, considering I have basically slagged off some of them already, but so my original PhD was going to be a novel linkage of several data sets. So I was using NHS inpatient data sets, the SMR01 and the SMR04 for people that aren't familiar. One is general inpatient and one is inpatient into the psychiatric wards. And I was going to link these. So unsurprisingly, or surprisingly, these didn't actually measure or capture, a diagnostic label. And if they did, it was usually in an optional box and it's just the doctor's handwriting. And the way this was recorded was ridiculous. Half the time they didn't even record the handwriting. Other times I've seen they just scanned the document and you couldn't read the doctor's writing. It was ridiculous. So it wasn't actually recorded in any meaningful way that could be helpful. So to get around this, we were going to connect this to the prescribing information system, which is a data set that captures all prescriptions out with of hospitals in Scotland. So again, these didn't usually capture diagnostic labels, but they did capture prescriptions, length of prescriptions, names, labels, like as in milligrams, things prescribed. And to capture, so these three data sets you'll see at the top, where capturing would help us capture the SMI through triangulation of my definitions, subjective variables and objective variables. So to give you an example, SMR04 would capture if someone was admitted to a psychiatric ward, and along with the prescribing information system, we could then triangulate if they had a severe mental illness by, first of all, length of stay, and secondly, the types of medication they were prescribed and length of prescription. Like if, for example, if you were prescribed quetiapine, for example, that's a second generation antipsychotic, it's usually prescribed for psychosis and schizophrenia conditions, but can also be prescribed in the short term for anxiety and sleep problems. So if someone was admitted to a ward and also had, say, a quetiapine prescription and it wasn't just for 2 weeks, say it was longer for years, we could then partly identify that that was probably a psychosis type condition. And finally, obviously the other part of my PhD was to find out employment prospects for people with severe or complex mental health conditions. And we were going to identify this through the Scottish longitudinal survey. I always want to say system, but I'm sure it's survey. So for people that don't know, this is actually a really great resource. It's held in a safe haven through Ladywell House in Edinburgh, which is a pain in the butt because you can't actually access the data from home. You need to go through to this one computer in Edinburgh. But the SLS is a 5% snapshot, if I remember rightly, of the overall Scottish population, drawn from different years. Apparently, I'm sure my supervisor said only like 2 people in the SLS actually know the years that people were drawn from. Like they just keep it secret, like the Iron Brew recipe or something. I really don't know what was happening there, but the SLS is secret apparently. So the SLS actually draws together loads of different admin data, like the census, educational data. I'm sure in the last year they've also linked into justice data. So it's a really rich, good resource, and importantly, it was longitudinal, which was important for my research considering I was trying to measure employment outcomes across the lifespan. So these were the data sets I was going to use. I did consider other data sets. I think at the start I had something like 15 data sets, and we basically narrowed it down to these 4, which through linkage and triangulation of definitions and several different variables, we could then identify severe or complex mental health issues, and then also track those people throughout their life. But yeah, so as I said, the SLS is held in a safe haven in Edinburgh. I'd spent the first 2 years of my PhD, first of all, I decided to switch from SPSS to R, so I had to, go with that learning curve. And secondly, had to get obviously trained up and prepared to access this data. It is highly sensitive data, that's why it's held in a safe haven. So I was finally booked in to get all my data linked and access my data, say on, like, it was March last year anyway, right? So 2 days before I was due to go through to Edinburgh to access my data, the UK went into national lockdown because of the coronavirus. The safe haven is still shut. I lost access to all of my data. It was obviously the backbone of my PhD. And then followed about 4 to 6 months of utter panic when I've now had to completely reorientate my PhD to data that I can access from the UK data service. But I can answer some questions about that at the end. So have I... Oh, we're at conclusions already. I must have spoke really fast. So, conclusions. How the presence and measurement and operationalisation, I love that word when it comes to statistics, it's just ridiculous, of what I've termed severe mental illness in individuals and admin and health data is still ongoing. I suppose that's partly why this PhD was funded in the first place. There's very little out there about how you measure the presence in especially survey type data, admin type data, any data, when it doesn't actually explicitly ask the people that. And yeah, one of the biggest hurdles has been defining what constitutes severe mental illness in the first place, because there's no gold standard. And yeah, without going on into too much of a rant, obviously especially recently, the thing that's come up for me is we as researchers really need to examine our own biases, and this is why I'm really passionate about reflexivity within the quantitative data science. And I've actually run training on it in the past. I do have materials if anyone is interested, but we really need to examine, first of all, why we're researching what we research. And when it comes to this kind, especially survey data, so take like the census and things. Obviously the census is going on in England just now, although it's online. In the past you would have surveyors getting into people's houses and asking really quite personal and complex questions that people might not want to answer in the first place. They might be made to feel uncomfortable. So we really, I think quantitative data science needs to take a step back and really examine how we get our data, how it's measured, how it's then recorded, how we access it, our own biases. There's just so much we need to consider that obviously people are very focused on. But stats is the gold standard. It's so objective, you can't go wrong with stats. And I just want to say, no, you're wrong. There's biases you need to examine. And but when I talk about it, people usually have a really confused look on their face and want to swiftly move on because they think, oh, reflexivity is for qualitative methodology. I'm here to tell you it's not. It's just not. So this, as I said before, it was obviously my PhD before the pandemic. I have now reorientated to data I can access from home on the UK data service. I'm hoping to still include this in the PhD because it was a lot of work, especially around triangulation of presence and measurement of SMI in data. And I'm really hoping that that goes forward to get published in some way, just so it can help others who are trying to measure not just mental health stuff in data, but anything that you want to get out of data that isn't explicitly captured. I hope this method that I've used can really help people in the future. So I think that is the slides over. So I'll stop sharing the screen and we can discuss a little bit when I'm not staring at these slides. So yeah, this is my contact info. I'm very shouty on Twitter about this stuff. If anyone is interested, give me a follow. I've also got a website where I update my